Hi, my name's Chris Day from Everyday Sustainable Living, and I'm here today with the City of Bokashi to talk about composting. It's a three-part series, and this is the first of that series, which we'll be talking about traditional composting. So that's compost piles, where we get a hot compost, and things like compost bins, things like that. So you might ask, what's composting? So composting is the breakdown, the decomposition of organic matter, anything that was natural, and it's the action of that with microbes and bacteria, creating the right conditions, breaking down into something called humus. Humus is basically plant superfood, so it's what plants use to grow, to get their nutrients, to hold their water, and that's what we're aiming to create. We're facilitating the natural process of composting, and we're speeding that up and creating the right conditions. Those conditions we'll go into further later, but the main conditions are aeration, moisture, and diversity. Those three things are what microbes love. They like something moist, not too wet, not too dry. They're alive, so they need that nice temperature range, and diversity of products in your compost. So as many different materials as you can. Now, what are the benefits of compost? The benefits of compost are huge. So compost helps improve soil life, micro activity, bacteria and beneficial fungi. Those things help to improve your soil, your water holding capacity, your plant nutrition, your plant health, which then in turn increases our health and the planet's health. So the benefits are huge. The other great thing about composting and stopping your food waste going into landfill is we're actually stopping methane gas being produced by organic matter being anaerobically broken down in landfill, and we're taking those nutrients back and we're putting them into our soil and sequestering carbon into our soil and nutrients into our soil. This also means building this healthy soil reduces our input costs for growing our own food. So it means we're building up the life in the soil, which helps feed our plants. And by doing things like adding compost teas, worm liquid, all that sort of thing, we can grow food pretty much without external inputs. Now, there's a lot of different types of composting. What we're going to be dealing with today is compost bins. So your Getty bins and your compost bins. We're going to be touching on compost tumblers and wire mesh, and then your bigger compost piles. So things like 3 pallet bays or a big pile, which is fantastic for dealing with a large amount of garden waste at one time and creating a hot compost and lots of compost at once. So food compost, so kitchen scraps and things like that, the best way to deal with that is in something like a compost bin. The main reason for that is because we're gradually adding over time, and those bins help encompass that, but also helps keep rodents out. A little bit later I'm going to show you how to put some mesh on the bottom of the bin to stop those rodents getting in there. And the beauty of that is you can manage that system quite easily, and it can fit in a very small garden. It's tidy, it's neat, etc. Now, that's a cooler type of composting, but it's still aerobic. So we're using things such as a compost screw, and that's helping get the air into that compost. So that's one of the main factors in composting, aeration. The other thing that helps mix the diversity being the other major factor. So all the different things we're adding into our compost, that's mixing those together and helping that break down. It's also a really good tool, whether you use a compost screw or a fork or a shovel. It's a good tool to actually observe what's happening in your compost. So is it moist? Is it too dry? Is it smelly? And if we're actively observing that, then we can very quickly remedy those things. There's no real way of failing compost, there's just the long, windy road. So if your compost pile dries out, then we can actually moisten that up, add more nitrogen-rich materials, and get that happening again. Now, there's two major components to composting. You have nitrogen-rich materials. So these include things like green lawn clippings, your kitchen scraps, and animal manures. Avoid manures such as domesticated animals like dogs and cats. Main reason is there can be some pathogens and things in their manure. So other animal manures you can use. So that's your nitrogen-rich thing. So think moist, think sort of hot. That's what gets the heat into the compost. Your other thing is things like carbon. So dry materials such as mulch, straw, dry lawn clippings, cardboard, paper, all that sort of stuff. That helps balance the nitrogen and stops you having just a stinky mess. Composting shouldn't be about creating something stinky and gross. It should smell earthy, it should be nice, and it should be an enjoyable process. So getting that carbon into the mix, not just your veggie scraps and your lawn clippings, really helps balance that out. In terms of actual ratios, the simplest way I find is if you add a bucket of vegetable scraps or green grass clippings, then you add a bucket of dry material on top. And you're basically making a compost lasagna. That is the same key to most types of composting that we'll be talking about over this series. The same as the hot composting, the same in your tumblers, and the same in the bins. So if you remember, half nitrogen rich, half carbon, and then the moisture, keeping it moist. So the moisture of a kitchen sponge that you're wiping your bench with, or a moisture of a moist pot plant or a moist garden bed, then that's the key. Now we'll touch on tumblers. So tumblers can work really well. Some people love them, some people find them difficult, some people find them heavy, some people find them great. So it really is about working out, talking to people who have tried them and seeing whether you think you might. The cost of the tumblers can be quite high. You can make your own, you can find them secondhand. The beauty of them is you're easily aerating them, they're up higher, you're not having to bend quite so much. You do need to be very careful, given they're not in contact with the soil, to make sure you get that balance of carbon and nitrogen right. So every bit of food scraps you add some carbon. You watch the moisture quite carefully. Don't let it get too dry, too wet. Your other systems which we'll be talking about are your compost bins. So these are provided by the City of Onkaparinga and work quite well as a system for your food scraps. Now the third thing we'll talk about is a wire mesh. If you live in a suburb where you get lots of deciduous leaves, whether it's out the front in the street or whether it's in your yard, those leaves can make a fantastic thing called leaf mould. So basically that's just making a wire ring and a chicken mesh, small mesh, and filling that with leaves in the autumn time. Over winter, that's getting rained on, it's keeping moist, and that breaks down slowly over about a 12-month process. That's a fantastic way to get otherwise wasted product that might be going into the oceans and things like that into your garden and get more carbon into your soil, and for things like potting mix and seed raising mixes. The fourth thing are piles of compost. So this is where we make a large pile, at least a cubic metre, so a metre by a metre by a metre, and we make that all at once. And we make what we were talking about earlier, that compost lasagna. So we start with the carbon layers, small dry sticks, and straw, things like that. Then we add our nitrogen layers, lawn clippings, prunings, garden waste when you're swapping over your garden. You can add a bit of manure for heat, and then we go back to carbon. So we're making a lasagna and we're building that lasagna up, making sure that's moist. So each time we add dry material, we're making sure it's moist, so we're watering it and building it as we go. Now, you can also seed composts or activate composts by adding a very active garden soil or some worm castings or an already mature compost. What that's doing is it's grabbing the microbes, billions of microbes, in a handful of compost. there are over 1 billion microbes and fungi. In a shovelful, if you spread them out, that's enough to get from here to the moon and back. Now that's huge. So by adding a shovelful of compost to your compost, whether it's your compost bin or a larger pile, you're inoculating that compost and you're helping that bacteria and that fungi to grow in the compost. Alright, so what we're going to do here is I've got some aviary mesh, so some bird wire mesh. It's got small squares. We've just cut a section about that much larger than your compost bin, and then we've just folded it around. What this is doing, and then you flip the bin into the location where you're going to make it, which in this particular case will be in the middle of the path. But a good place to do it would actually be in the garden bed, not too far from a fruit tree, or in the garden bed you actually want to add that compost to once it's done. Generally on the soil is best. Put in these little flaps. What these do, it means we can actually get the compost, what I call bandicooting the compost, out from the bottom if we just want a little bit before the whole compost bin's ready. Okay, so now we're ready to start our compost. First thing we do is we start with carbon. So I've got some straw here. I'm going to put about a 10 centimetre layer on the bottom. Spread it out. That's our pasture sheet, so that's our first level of the compost. What that does is that's going to take any sort of liquids or moisture and things out and help keep that aerobic. We can also add things like twigs, small twigs and things like that. Nothing much bigger than your little finger. So this is some acacia, and we can just cut that up with our secateurs. Now, a lot of people have these in their yards or nearby, so it's a eucalypt. Try and avoid using too much of that in your compost. It's got a very high oil content, also has things in the plant that actually can inhibit plant growth, so not the best thing to put in your compost. We can put that in the green bin. We can still put a few more sticks, so we just chop those up. So that's getting the air. First layer is your air layer, so your carbon layer. So we've got a few leaves here, and whack in a few leaves. Now, the second layer of the lasagna is your nitrogen. So I've got some fresh lawn clippings here, so we can add some of those. Make sure you sprinkle them out a bit. Don't have them all as one layer. I'm not going to add all of them at once. Then I've got some seeding silver beet from the garden. So I'm just going to chop that up quickly. Just getting the particle sizes smaller. The smaller the particles, the quicker it will compost. So you don't want a whole cabbage in there. You want to mash up. If the cabbage has gone bad, you want to mash that up. So a bit of that. Then there's things that I call compost activators, or mineral rich things. So these include things like borage. Bees love it, but it's a deep rooted plant, so it draws up nutrients from the soil that other plants can't get. Another compost activator is nettle. Again, it's a really good plant for improving soil on its own right where it grows, but also in a compost because it gets those nutrients up out of the ground that other plants don't have access to. Then one of my favourites for composting, I've used most of it so I've only got a few leaves, is something that's called comfrey. So comfrey again is a very deep rooted plant, full of minerals. Fantastic plant in general to have in your garden, but also really good to put in your compost. And I've got another thing, so that shows you the taproot. So any plant that's got a nice big taproot is pulling out nutrients that most plants can't get. So that's a fantastic thing to whack in your compost. Just cut that up. And we've got some veggie scraps. So you can see I've got a bit of a mix here. Got some avocado seed, they always seem to get in the compost. We've got some eggshells, you can just crush those. I've got a whole carrot that went bad. So ideally, we'd just quickly just chop that into a few bits. Same with a sweet potato that went bad, it's fallen apart anyway. Now, I've got some things in here, some citrus, fine to go in the compost. Not fantastic in your worm farm, but totally fine in your compost. Also got some tea bags. Probably should be looking at organic tea bags if you are having them, but this is all biodegradable, so that can go in there too. Here's a tea bag without the string and the staple. And we've got some paper toweling and things like that. So that's your carbon mixed in with your compost. So I'm going to just tip that in there. So that's our nitrogen layer. Then what we're going to do, after we've added our bucket of nitrogen, our veggie scraps, we sprinkle equal parts of carbon on top. So that's basically the start of your compost. If I was making a hot compost right now, so if I was going to finish that all at once, I would continue that method all today. So I'd continue to put nitrogen-rich materials, carbon materials, nitrogen-rich, and stack them up. It's the same process, but we do this over a series of weeks to months. So we come out with our bucket of veggie scraps and we tip those in, and then at the same time then we add our carbon layer on top. What you're doing by adding that carbon layer on top of your veggie scraps is you're helping balance out that nitrogen. You're also stopping it smelling. You're also stopping things like flies and vermin being attracted to it because it's covered. One thing you can also do if it does get a bit smelly is you can even just grab a bit of your garden soil, some I prepared earlier, and cover that on top. So if you've got something particularly on the nose, covering it in some of your garden soil will get rid of that odour. Now, if you get that lasagna right, you don't need to turn it very often, but turning it will increase the air in your system, make your compost quicker, and also, like I was mentioning earlier, you're keeping an eye on it. So basically this is called a compost turner, and you're just turning and pulling up, and that's incorporating all of the materials. And you'd repeat that. What I try and do is I just leave that next to my compost bin. When I add stuff to it, then I'll just quickly turn it after I add to it. Now when you're leaving your compost bin, it's important to grab your lid and to put that on there. That stops things that you don't want getting in your compost. So you've got your wire on the bottom, which is stopping your rodents burrowing in there, but letting the nutrients go into the soil. You've got your lid on there, which is stopping things getting in there. Also, in winter and in wet seasons, it stops it getting too wet. And in the dry seasons, it actually helps keep the moisture in there. The beauty of these particular compost bins is they actually have some air slots in the bin, which helps actually keep that aerated, which helps for that compost not to get too putrid. It does mean in the warmer months, in the drier months, in summer, that we will need to add supplementary water to make sure it doesn't dry out. Now, the what not to's. So, you might have something like this growing in your garden. There's a bit of a clump here. So thistles. Thistles are fantastic, but if you don't want to proliferate them, all you need to do, instead of putting the whole thistle in your green bin, you just take the seed heads off and you put the rest in your compost. The other thing, the majority of this plant is vegetation, but there's just some seed heads there. They're probably just a little bit too mature for my liking, so we can just snip those off and put the rest in the compost. So then you're only actually putting a very small amount in your green waste bin. Now you might ask, why am I putting it in the green waste bin instead of my compost? The reason is the green waste goes to a large facility. It's a massive pile or series of piles that's turned systematically. Moisture and microbes are added into there, and that pile heats up to above 70 degrees. What that does is it kills off any pathogens and weed seeds. So by putting things that we don't want to spread in our garden into the green bin, then they're able to process that in a facility that's able to get to those temperatures. The other things you don't want to add to your compost, or too much of it, are things like meats, dairies, cheeses, because that can attract things you don't want and can get smelly. Also anything that's not inorganic, so anything that's man-made, so plastics and things like that. Anything that's natural, that has once been living, can go in your compost bin, including paper, cardboard and all that sort of stuff, as long as you make it moist before you put it in there and shred it. So carbon is a paper, cardboard and things like that is another great source of carbon. Here we have a compost pile. So this is a hot compost. It was made all at once in one day, and we do the compost lasagna. So down the bottom we're putting things like thin prunings about the size of your pinky finger and some carbon material such as straw. So that's your first layer of lasagna, that's your pasta. Then you're adding your sauce. So you're adding your lawn clippings, your garden greens, your different manures if you've got them to generate more heat, like chicken or cow, etc. And then we're going more brown, more green. This time of year and in the change of the seasons, you're quite often clearing your garden beds, so you can generate a lot of green waste all at once. Rather than removing that nutrients off your site, you want to keep that on your site and incorporate that back into your soil. So we use those as part of our green layer. We can even dry those out and use them as part of our carbon or dry layer. So we keep doing that up until roughly a metre or so high, and we're aiming for a cubic metre by a cubic metre. We can inoculate that as we go by adding some pre-made compost or worm castings, or we can even water it with some worm juice or compost tea to help incorporate those microbes into the pile. There we have a hot compost. Alright, so this is the compost that we've just started making. We're now going to go over to here . Now this compost bin we've just finished. So as you can see, we've got a mix of greens from the garden. We've got some old broad beans, some weeds, and then underneath that we've got a layer of some carbon and some soaked cardboard. So fantastic way to get some carbon into your compost without having to import anything. So that's layered the whole way up. So that's just finished. We'll put a lid on that and we'll let that brew for a month or two. Okay, so here we have a compost that's been sitting there for around a month or two, and you can see that it's almost broken down. So I'm going to use this compost stirrer, stir it up. Now, it's almost fully composted, but you can see there's some sections that you can still realise what it is. So for example, you can still see just that little bit of grass clippings in there. You can still see the odd stick. You're probably going to have a few sticks in there, don't be too worried about that, they'll break down over time. So this compost I would give probably around another month. By stirring it, we're seeing the moisture content is quite nice. We're seeing the diversity in there of all the different materials. So in a month or so, that'll be ready to put out. Alright, so here we have our third compost bin, which is finished. So this has been sitting there for around 3 months, and it's turned into this beautiful black humus-like compost. So that's ready to use. You can't see very much, there's worms in there, there's the odd slater, etc. But you can't recognise what was once in there. That's the thing that I take as it being ready. You might see the odd stick, but that's fine. That's going to take a lot longer to break down. We can actually use that in the base of our new compost. So we can put that aside there. What we're going to do now is we're going to show you how to use the compost. So we've made this awesome compost, now the exciting part. So we can lift this bin completely off. And from here we can just grab some compost, if there is some sections of unbroken compost, we can always put that back into the new compost we've started, or it will continue to break down as we put it in the garden. And the beauty of having it here, any compost I spill, as you can see, is actually going to go fertilise this lovely peach tree. So over here, we've got a garden bed that we've prepared, we've weeded that, we've put that in our new compost, and then we've got a nice garden bed, but it needs some compost. So we're going to put that there. Now, depending on how much compost you've got and depending on the size of your garden, you want to aim at around, if you've got a large garden that you want to spread the compost far, you want a couple of centimetres. If you've got an intensive garden where you want a lot of nutrients, you can go up to 10 centimetres thick with compost. What I'm doing here, I'm just incorporating that into the soil. Now, I can see that this soil over here is a bit poorer, so I'm going to actually just grab a bit more compost. We're going to plant pumpkins in here. Pumpkins love compost. So we're not necessarily burying it, but we're just incorporating that into the soil. What that's doing, enriching the soil, making sure you don't get a different layer, so you're incorporating it together. Then what we'll do is we'll water that and we'll mulch it. The mulching is the most important part to actually keep that moisture and that nutrients in your garden. An unmulched garden on a hot summer's day, let's say it's 35 degrees, an unmulched garden can get 60 to 70 degrees Celsius. You can imagine that kills all your microbe life, it all evaporates, all your moisture goes out of it, and your nutrients leave. A mulched garden will stay somewhere between 20 and 25 degrees. So you're not getting that same amount of evaporation, and you're keeping those microbes that are doing all the work, that are helping your plants grow, nice and safe, nice and moist, so they continue to do their work. Troubleshooting. So it's the big day, you've unveiled your compost and you've got a section that's not quite ready. That's okay. What we can do is we can just take that section and we can put that in our next compost. Sometimes what happens is you don't get everything all stirred in beautifully and you might have a big pile of something. So we can simply take that, incorporate that in our compost, stir it through, and that'll actually help that compost to your new compost to activate. Other troubleshooting. So there'll be lots of other things on top of microbes and fungi that live in your compost. We're avoiding rats by putting the wire around it and the lid and covering anything that might be really tasty for them. But you'll have things like worms, slaters, earwigs, different what's called detrivores, which are critters that like helping break things down. They're as important to the composting process as your microbes and your fungi. So don't be too alarmed about that. One thing you do want to avoid is things like flies or maggots. So if you open up your bin and you've got flies and maggots in there, it probably means you've got a bit too much nitrogen or food scrap material, not enough carbon. So the best thing to do with that is you grab your compost stirrer, you stir it through, and you cover that with a thin layer of garden soil or carbon. And that's a good indicator that you just need to be putting that bucket of carbon after your bucket of veggie scraps. That's flies. Ants. Ants are another thing that sometimes will want to live in a compost bin. Now, that's generally a sign your compost might be a bit too dry and it might be acidic. You can fix that in two ways. You can add something called dolomite lime or gardener's lime. That brings the pH up, makes it not acidic anymore, more alkaline, and at the same time you water it. So that's an indication that your compost might be a bit dry if you've got ants in it. The dolomite and the water will get rid of those ants almost instantaneously. The other thing you might find, you might open up your compost bin and you'll find things growing in there. It's the perfect conditions for things to grow. Don't be alarmed about it. I've actually grown some peaches and avocados and pumpkins and tomatoes that I've transplanted out of my compost. If that comes in the right time of year, you can do that. Otherwise, you can literally stir those in and they just become compost again. So not anything to be too alarmed about. And the smells, like we touched on earlier, if you open up your compost bin and it's quite smelly, too much nitrogen, add your carbon, add your soil, give it a stir, and you'll be in luck. The main thing with composting is you give it a go, and like I said before, if you're observing and you're changing and you're interacting with it, you'll always get to compost in the end. It might take you a little bit longer and you'll get better at it with practice. The City of Onkaparinga offers great subsidies on bins such as this or the next size up. And also, if you'd like to find more info on what we've been talking about today, there'll be links at the end of this video at the City of Onkaparinga's website. We'd also like to thank you very much for joining us today, and we wish you a healthy and happy composting journey into the future.